feed us top. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 70 organizations in Massachusetts planning ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Jack Kelly. This is actually not your first time talking with us. Jack is a prolific author. He is a historian as well as a novelist, public scholar. We had him on a year or two ago to talk about his book about the Valcour Island battle. He's also wrote a really remarkable book called Band of Giants, the amateur soldiers who won America's independence. But today we're going to talk about your new book, which is God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man. So, Jack, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's really great to be talking to you.
So let me just ask, what drew you to tell the story of Benedict Arnold?
Well, partly it was because I had dealt with Arnold in my previous books, in Band of Giants. Like many people, I was read the Kenneth Roberts novels and the tremendous adventure story of the march over the Maine Mountains. And I, of course, wrote the book about the Valcour campaign, which was almost entirely Benedict Arnold. It was also involved Horatio Gates and Philip Schuyler, but a great achievement for Arnold. And I just felt that I wanted to sort of wind up the story, round it out. And Arnold is a great portal into the Revolution, the first 3 years of the Revolution, because he was involved in the biggest operations and the most heroic activities of the 75, 76, and 77. So I think, particularly with the 250th anniversary coming up, the idea of Arnold as a familiar name to everybody, pulling people into the story of the Revolution. And in many ways, Arnold reflected the times. He's always depicted as somewhat of an anomaly because he was treasonous, but it was a complicated and very conflicted time in the country, and he was sort of embodied that.
Really, because you have this remarkable heroism at the beginning of the war, which is one of the things that then makes his treason such a terrific blow to Washington and others. If Arnold is a traitor, who can we trust?
Exactly.
So what do you think motivated him to become a traitor?
Well, that question, why did he do it, is, it's always comes down to that. And many reasons have been given. He gave quite a few reasons himself. Different historians have had their favorite theories.
Yes.
Was it the money? Did he do it mostly for the money that he was going to get paid? Was it his wife influencing him? Peggy Shippen was a loyalist-leaning young lady. Was it the French alliance? He grew up hating the French, and the French alliance, he at one point claimed that was a cause, or he didn't like independence. Was it the promotions that he did or didn't get, the conflicts he had with Congress? And of all these reasons, the answer I always give is I don't know why he did it. It's hard to imagine that any of those particular reasons would have been enough to cause this life-changing decision. And as I have said a few times, I sometimes wonder if he knew himself why he did it.
Yeah.
He was not an introspective character, and he was not really a thinker. He was a man of action, and he just did things. And so it's, I discuss a lot in the book, a lot of the factors that were involved.
Right. Yeah, I wonder, Jack, if we can talk a little bit more about his background. You said he's a man of action, and that actually starts at a young age. So can you tell us a bit about who he was before we get to the Revolution?
Yeah, one of the questions that I'm often asked, Bob, is why if he had no military training, which he'd had almost none, no military experience, why did he suddenly become a military hero? I mean,
Right.
and he really was had an uncanny feel for tactics and strategy from the very beginning. And I would think of it as really the product of his being a sea captain. His father had a trading business down to the West Indies, did quite well at it for a while. Then he became an alcoholic later and ran into business difficulties. But Arnold sort of picked up the family baton and carried on the same business, bought ships, and was the captain of ships. Some merchants in New England, just stayed home and sent the ships out, but he went down to the West Indies because it was more profitable to do that. And that was a job that required a great sense of command, a lot of planning, attention to detail, an ability to really to push forth your personality over whether it's your crew or the men you're trading with or whatever. And I think he developed those skills, and that enhanced his the fact that he really was a natural warrior. A few of those people it just felt when he went in 1775 and went into action, it just felt like he was fulfilling his destiny, I think.
Right, and he is in command, and he's used to being in command of men on a small ship where you need to do things quickly and effectively, and the captain has to be the captain.
And it's sort of an isolated job. You didn't fraternize with your crew if you were the captain, and they had a fairly small crew, so there wasn't a lot of other officers on the ship. So he would sit alone in his cabin most of the time, and then command from on high.
Right. Yeah. But then he does have, you make a point in your book about the relationship he strikes up with Joseph Warren, and Warren, doctor, and Arnold had been running an apothecary shop in New Haven.
Yeah. Benedict Arnold is often referred to as an apothecary, and he did have an apprenticeship with some relatives of his mother after his father's business went down the tubes. He was an apprentice, which was a big step down for him and for the family as a whole. And he became, this family was treated him very well, set him up in business in New Haven in an apothecary shop. But in those days, apothecary was really a luxury goods store. They sold medicine, they sold things we associate with a drugstore, but they also sold books and perfumes and fine. And then he got into trading, and he traded horses and lumber to a large extent, and developed that business and was quite successful at it. So when he went up, a few days after the Battle of Lexington, and the news reached New Haven, he marched immediately with a small militia company. Got up to Cambridge, where the Patriots were besieging the British in Boston. Met Joseph Warren. He was only there for 2 days. Had almost like a mind meld with Warren. They became very close friends. They both saw things exactly the same. We're at war. We have to push the war. We can't. There's not going to be reconciliation. A lot of people were still talking about reconciliation, and so. Warren was the man who got him the position as colonel in the Massachusetts militia, and sent him out to Western Massachusetts to drum up a regiment out of people out in the West, and then take over Ticonderoga, which was Arnold's idea for a way to get the cannon that they needed to confront the British.
Right. Yeah, and so he does. And then why don't we talk about the Canada campaign again? Kenneth Roberts really paints a great picture of it. You do as well. I mean, that is really such an extraordinary campaign that we actually don't talk a whole lot about because.
Well, it's a little embarrassing. That our first, the Patriots' first impulse was to invade another colony, though. if you look at it from their point of view, it did make a lot of sense. It was deprived the British of a base from which they could invade, and that was the whole idea. And Arnold wrote up a plan to invade Canada, which Congress was at first very reluctant, and then adopted, but didn't move as quickly as he thought they should. They gave the assignment ultimately to Richard Montgomery, who led the American campaign up the St. Lawrence River from Lake Champlain. And Arnold, in an idea that I guess was floating around the camp in Boston, that he should go up over the main mountain. So there was this trail, and it was always a little bit murky in exactly who decided to do it. It was probably not the best idea in the world, but he took 1,000 men trying to go over just a trail that went through the woods, poorly mapped. They had all their supplies in boats, and they spent most of their time pushing the boats upstream in the Kennebec River, wading in ice water. They ran out of food, partly because a lot of the food got ruined by the water, and partly because it just took a lot longer than they thought it was going to. And Arnold reached a point, they were about halfway to Canada, and he reached a point where he had to decide. And it was 1,000 men's lives were depending on his decision. It seemed like it was too late to go back, but they didn't know what was ahead of them. And so he decided, he convinced them, and he had this great sense of like stepping up to the crisis. And he convinced all his officers that I'll go forward alone with a small group of men, get the food, and send it back to you while you continue on with the expedition, which he was able to do, but in just barely in the nick of time.
That's an
really remarkable, and came pretty close to taking the city of Quebec, which was their goal. But got there a few days too late and had to wait for Montgomery. Whether Montgomery did a good job in that campaign, he was such a martyr. So he was one of the earliest and the highest ranking men to be killed in the war. He was revered then. He continues to be revered to the extent that he's remembered at all. But I don't think he did a very good job. I think he was too slow. He could have moved a lot faster. And once he got up there and saw the situation, it really was foolish to try to attack Quebec, but he did, and cost his life.
We're talking with Jack Kelly, author most recently of God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man. Really talking about this guy we all know as the traitor, but actually before he's a traitor, he's actually one of the leading military men of the Revolution. And we've just been talking about the beginning of the Canada campaign. I know you've written a book about Valcour Island, so maybe we don't need to talk more about that, although it's another story. Then it seems like Arnold is always pushing against those who are. Your book begins with that wonderful anecdote about David Worcester and the New Haven committee saying, no, we want to wait and see, and Arnold demanding the keys to the powder house so they can get their supplies and be off to Lexington and Concord.
Well, I think that one thing that always struck me about Arnold is he had a strategic view of things. And there's a lot of great, and you'd say, some of the great sort of General Patton types who are tactically brilliant and in battle are, but don't have the bigger picture in mind all the time. But somehow Arnold had that strategic view of things, what had to be done, and then how to do them was the tactical. And that came up again and again in his career.
Yeah, he really does combine these two things, and plus, of course, his charismatic ability to lead men.
Absolutely, he had a great confidence, and was apparently very persuasive. We don't have a lot of his. I mean, he didn't leave behind a lot of writings or men that recorded his speeches, but somehow he was able to really persuade people that his idea was right, and it usually was right.
It's amazing. The war does bring forward a number of people like this. It reveals these talents, like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, even Washington, would have had much different lives, if not for this big event that they're all involved in.
Yeah, I think that's true, particularly of Henry Knox and Greene. I mean, both pretty successful in their careers that they'd chosen, as was Washington, and were drawn into the war and found themselves in the war. And I think that is true of Arnold even more so, that when he got into the fighting, he found that he had a gift that was, I'm sure it must have surprised him almost too, for whatever experience he had. He just had this gift for war that was changed his life entirely.
Now, would you say he is the real hero of Saratoga?
I think it's the dispute about the various aspects of Saratoga was had Arnold been relieved of his command? Was he having a dispute with Gates? Looking at that as thoroughly as I could and through all the records, I think that whole episode was overblown. I think it was pushed by his aides, who were friendly with Philip Schuyler, who was very resentful of being pushed out of command in the North, and of Gates's main aide, which was James Wilkinson, who was a notorious kind of gossip and troublemaker. And they, in the end, it didn't really mean anything. And Gates was not about to send him back or to deprive him of command. And that Arnold really was in command. There was a letter, of course, that came out a few years ago that they called the Bachelor Letter, that was written 2 days after the battle, that just indicated that both Gates and Arnold were cooperating and were on the battlefield at times. It wouldn't have been appropriate, particularly for Gates, to be out on the battlefield as the commanding general. He had to be somewhere where he could always be found. And the same thing for Arnold in a lot of ways. As a major general, he should have been behind the lines, which he was most of the time. And I think that his management of the battle really paid off. But I also give a lot of credit to Gates, and some people seem to think, well, it's who was it? Was it Gates or Arnold? Well, I think that it was teamwork. Gates had the strategic vision of wearing down Burgoyne, and that was what put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do something that in the second battle was really kind of foolish, but he was desperate. And so having been put in that position, then Arnold rallied the troops and led the charge.
Now, when he went off to Lexington and Concord in 1775, he left behind his wife, who was in bad health, young children. So what happens to his family while he's away?
Well, while he was up in around Ticonderoga and that campaign in 75, his wife died unexpectedly. She was never in very good health, but and left 3 sons behind. His sister then took over the care of his sons, and his wife and sister had both been involved in the business. He would go off when he was going off. That was, of course, the disadvantage of being a sea captain. You were out of touch with your business, so they would take it over, and were quite well versed in his business. But it was hard. It was a hard time because of the British blockades and trading, and you had to really maneuver. And his sister told him, as your business is going down, but he immediately, pushed on. He was very grieved by his wife's death, but he pushed and went on assignment, whatever it was.
And then what about his sons? What happens to them?
Well, they stayed there in New Haven with his sister, and he got to see them a few times during the war or before the Saratoga campaign, but very rarely, because after he took off for Maine, to go over the main mountains into Canada. He was in Canada then for a long time. It was after Montgomery was killed. He was in command in Canada and had to wait and had been wounded and he had to recover and then went right down into the Valcourt campaign all the summer of the next summer. So he didn't get home all that much during that period of the war.
We're talking with Jack Kelly, author most recently of God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man. So then after this, he gets the command in Philadelphia after the British evacuate Philadelphia. They occupied it for a year or so. So what led to him being given command in Philadelphia?
Well, a lot of people say, it was one of George Washington's rare personnel mistakes that he should never have put Arnold in charge there. It was a politically very delicate situation because so many of the Philadelphians had cozied up to the British while they were there, and then who was really a loyalist and who was a leaning a loyalist. And Arnold, that was the one thing that he didn't have was tact and a political sense of how to maneuver diplomatically. And so he threw in largely with the wealthier people in the city. He liked to live the high life and courted Peggy Shippen, who was the daughter of a family that was leaning loyalist. They weren't flat out loyalists, but they leaned that way, and she apparently did too. Had been very friendly with British officers, and he married her. And he was hard up for money. He cut a few corners to try to make some money. That was all. It was a little fuzzy during the Revolution. I mean, Nathaniel Greene, who was a quartermaster general, made a lot of money in dealing with the army as well. So, and he was never accused of. I'm
sorry, Jack. We're worried about not saying bad things about Nathaniel Greene on this pod. I know Arnold was a Rhode Islander, and his family was from Rhode Island. But is this like Rhode Island trash talking each other, the other generals? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I'm actually a big admirer of Nathaniel Greene too. So I think particularly down south he did a great job. I'm just saying that things were different then as far as. But that led to Arnold being reprimanded. They got up a court martial. Washington gave him the most gentle reprimand in history. But he still didn't like it, and he thought that he was not being appreciated, and he started thinking. And soon after he married Peggy Shippen, he made contact with the British and started the plot to go over.
Yeah. So was it his maneuvering that got him in command at West Point, or did Washington say, "Let's move him out of Philadelphia and send him someplace safer"?
No, actually, Washington wanted him to come back into a field command, and said he would make him his second in command. And by that time, Arnold had this idea of getting command over West Point and giving that over to the British, and so he said he was still his leg had been shattered at Saratoga, and he was still recovering, so he declined that invitation to go back into active service, and said that's he wanted to command the lower Hudson Valley and West Point, and so that's what Washington gave him, and that's where the plot reached its conclusion.
So why West Point? Why was West Point such a strategic position that the British would have paid Arnold to get their hands on?
Well, they had the idea from the beginning of the war of that corridor, which we don't think much of now, but it was a water corridor that ran from New York City up the Hudson River, up Lake George, Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River up to Montreal. That was like a super highway of that time. And it was very crucial for communications and the ability of the British to cut off communications from New England to the Middle States. And of course, there was no military academy there then. It was simply a fort, but it was the strategic fort protecting the river from being taken by the British. Whether if they had taken it, they would have won the war has been debated. I think it's possible, but it's probably not likely. But it would have been a blow that, in a bad year for the Patriots, which 1780 certainly was, it might have prompted them to begin negotiations of a negotiated settlement rather than push through to victory.
There was some thinking at the time, too, that Arnold, being such a popular figure, would bring others with him. And that doesn't really happen. So what happens to Arnold once he does go over to the British side?
Yeah, that was a fortunate development that he didn't inspire others to join him. And even when he went over, became a brigadier general in New York on the British side, and tried to raise a regiment of loyalists, which he did, but there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for that either, even though they would be serving under the great Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
He then fought down in Virginia for a while, did fairly well, and then was given the assignment of raiding New London, Connecticut, which was pretty much his hometown. He'd been born just a few miles north of there, and so he went up there. And in the process, there was not only they burned part of the town, but there was a massacre in the Fort Griswold on the other side of the river that Arnold wasn't really responsible for, but didn't help his reputation any. And then he went over to England on the same ship that Cornwallis did after Yorktown.
Wow.
So
then he lives the rest of his life in England.
He and his second wife, both his wives were named Peggy, so Peggy Shippen, lived in London. That didn't get a real warm reception there. In particular, Arnold wanted to get back into the military. I mean, he realized that the military was his life, and he could never, after the fighting ended in America, he could never get another assignment. Even tried to get into the East India Company that had its own military force, and even they didn't want him. He and Peggy went to Canada for about 6 years. He tried to get into business up there in a community of loyalists. Then went back and essentially got back into the business he'd left, which was to trade down to the West Indies, and he'd made numerous trips down to the West Indies and trading.
Wow. What happens to his sons by his first marriage?
They joined up with him when he moved to Canada. His sister and the three sons came up there. A couple of them stayed in Canada and ran the businesses that he had started up there, and all of them got commissions in the British Army. And all the sons, he had, I think, 3 or 4 more sons with his second wife in England. They all got commissions as part of the sort of the reward from the British, and served. His eldest son, who was also named Benedict, was killed in the Napoleonic Wars in Jamaica. But all the sons served and apparently did fairly well. And in generations down the Arnold line, many of them went right down to World War I think was the last, and were generals or high commands in the British Army.
Interesting. We're talking with Jack Kelly, public scholar, historian, novelist, about his new book, God Save Benedict Arnold, The True Story of America's Most Hated Man. Now, Jack, you've been immersed in the story of the Revolution for some time, and you've written three books on the Valcour and the Band of Giants. I'm wondering, in doing this one, what are some of the things that surprised you to find out about the story of Benedict Arnold? It's a very well-known story, but you're always uncovering new things.
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of what were the surprises. And I'm drawing a blank. I'm sure there were surprises. A lot of it had to do with the reasons for his thing, and I think the most telling thing, and I suppose it was a surprise in a way, was that I really got convinced that Benedict Arnold was a man of action in a very pure sense, and that it's a lot of the biographies have tried to have an intellectual understanding of him as if he was an intellectual, as if he had thought out these things. Right. And I think that's not true. I think that he was a person who is hard for scholars to understand, maybe because it's just,
we're not men of action, right?
That's what it comes down to, and it's projecting onto him doesn't work. I mean, you have to try to look into him,
right?
And it's a difficult nut to crack, and I think it's ultimately he's a very opaque character. He's not a character we can dissect and say this was the result of his personality or the result of his background. I always cite not only was his father he saw his father go downhill and become an alcoholic, but his mother was a Puritan, and she had sent him many letters about you always have to be aware that you're going to die. And he didn't become religious as she was, but he, I think, absorbed that message. And one of the reasons he was effective in the military was that he had that idea. He was a fatalist, and I don't care if I die. I'm going to do what's necessary. So that was part of that same complex of man of action, that he was willing to risk everything at any moment.
That's interesting. So I just recalled what Ulysses S. Grant wrote to William Tecumseh Sherman when Grant was writing his memoirs. He said, "I realized that I am a verb and not a noun."
That's good.
A man of action. And Arnold was. Did he write a lot of letters?
No, he was not there are a few letters that he wrote to his wife have survived, but he was not. He was the type of guy. He after his first wife died, and he started courting a young woman in Boston. It was quite a bit younger than he was. He sent her a whole trunk of gowns. That was his kind of ham-handed way of courting her.
Wow.
And sent her these letters of the usual flowery language of the time. He then after she rejected him, he exactly copied those letters and sent them to Peggy Shippen, too. Wow. Exact same language.
Wow.
And there he was successful. So try again.
That's interesting. Were they original letters to him, or had he copied them from like a manual of courting?
That's a good question. I think the originals were somewhat original, at least.
Yeah. Wow. So that's amazing.
Recycle them.
Yes, why not? We're talking with Jack Kelly, author of God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man, which is available to a great book. It's really retells this story that we might think is familiar, but Jack's really looked at it in a new way. Anything else we should talk about, Jack? I mean, it's a great story, and I don't want to discourage people from buying the book, and we don't want to give it all away. But is there anything we should say?
Somebody asked me, there had been a number of biographies and of Arnold. Why another book? And I think there's a couple of things that I would point to. One is that my book is not really a biography. It's making the case for Arnold.
Right.
And so it's pretty succinct. it clears up, I think, some of the distortions that even the later biographies that crept into the later biographies of, particularly about Saratoga, but also Ticonderoga, which the takeover of Ticonderoga by Benedict Arnold was very, very crucial to the whole war effort for the first several years. And yet it's not, it's never given the stature of like Bunker Hill.
I know. We didn't even talk about it, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah. So I've tried to go into those things and show where, how Arnold's role, how important it was. And also the main thing I would point to is just, I try to tell a story and to turn this man of action into an action story. So that's, I think, a little bit different than the more academic biographies.
Right. Good. Well, thank you for writing it. Thank you for doing that. It's a good book. So we've been talking with Jack Kelly, public scholar, historian, novelist. New book, God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man, a great action story. So thank you so much for joining us, Jack.
Oh, thank you, Bob. It's been a pleasure.
Look forward to talking to you again. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our many friends. Jack, when last time you were on, we were imagining then we'd have just a few folks listening who are in and around Boston. We actually have a great loyal groups of listeners around the world. And every week I thank them. If you're one of these folks in one of these places, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And so this week, I want to thank our listeners in Ticonderoga, New York, and in Norwalk, New London, New Haven, and Waterbury in Connecticut, Charlestown, Indiana, Madison, Ohio, and Madison Heights, Michigan, and in Naples, Italy, and all points beyond and between. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.